Nextv Plus USA session on tackling the biggest challenges in streaming TV. I'm Paul Erickson of Erickson Strategy and Insights, and I'm joined today by a panel with truly deep expertise to discuss the obstacles facing the industry today and tomorrow and how to conquer them. So in our current market today, we see a situation where streaming has come unbelievably far overall since inception, and particularly in the last couple of years. And you name it, in terms of societal acceptance, engagement, device adoption, consumer entertainment budget commitment, and so on. But now the pressure is on. It's really on. The market is maturing. Fiscal pressures on industry management are high. Lean times for consumers loom in the near future, and traditional subscription growth has slowed. So when it comes to factors like efficiency, content selection, user friendliness, engagement, churn, monetization, reliability, scale, performance, business optimization, and more, wherever the challenges lie, the time for the industry to solve them, it really is now. So to help us identify today's most significant challenges for the industry and how to take them on, we have a deep and diverse mix of perspective and insight on tap for you. And with us today, we have Tony Jones, Principal Technologist at MediaKind, Eric Opeka, Chief Strategy Officer at Cinedigm, Jason Thibault, Executive Director of the Streaming Video Technology Alliance, and Christopher White, SVP and Chief Product Officer at Endeavor Streaming. Welcome, everybody. Tony, let's start with you. Briefly tell us a bit about yourself and your work Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, hi, I'm Tony Jones, Principal Technologist at MediaKind. So my role is to look at technical and commercial trends and innovations and try and help form the company strategy based on that. MediaKind as a whole, its expertise is in media processing software and solutions for content owners, operators, broadcasters, and streaming services, including things like encoding, transcoding, packaging, targeted advertising, as well as TV platforms for both operators and D2C streaming services. So that's MediaKind in a nutshell and my role in it.
Perfect. Thank you. Eric, what about you? Tell us about you and what you do at Sling TV. I'm sorry, at what you do at Cinedigm. Sorry.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Eric Opeka. I'm the President, Chief Strategy Officer at Cinedigm. Cinedigm is a streaming platform company. We operate 30 streaming channels and operate a library of about 50,000 hours. We're also in the construction business. You can see behind me. I'm kidding. Apologies for the drop cloths. I had a tree hit the house, so my setting is less than elegant as Paul has with his background.
Yes, well, it's not that elegant behind me. Thanks to virtual backgrounding, I cleaned it up quite a bit. Jason, tell us a bit about yourself and your work at the SVTA.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, sorry about the video difficulties. Kind of ironic, given that I'm the Executive Director of the Streaming Video Technology Alliance. So we're a technology consortia similar to IETF and SIMT and W3C and all those folks. And what we do is provide a forum for collaboration for the ecosystem of streaming video to come together and solve really hard technical challenges for delivering high quality video at scale. So we've got working groups that cover pretty much all of the streaming video workflow.
Thanks, Jason. Lastly, Chris, tell us a bit about you and what you do at Endeavor Streaming and their mission.
Yeah, and my name's Chris White. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Endeavor Streaming. We provide end-to-end video services for direct-to-consumer streaming companies, from content owners to MVPDs. I oversee product development with both our consumer applications as well as our back-end business frameworks.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. And as for me, I'm Paul Erickson. I have nearly 2 decades of experience as an industry analyst with MPD, Parks Associates, IHS Markit, and Omdia. And I'm the founder and principal of Erickson Strategy and Insights, which is an industry and competitive analysis consultancy that covers the media and entertainment technology and consumer electronics markets. So let's dive right into our first question because we've got a lot to go through and not a lot of time. So first, this is for everybody here. We're going to dive into things in detail in a minute, but just to start, let's get a top-level read on the topic from each of your perspectives. What do each of you think is the biggest, most important challenge to solve in streaming today? Whoever wants to jump in.
I can jump in first.
Chris.
Fragmentation of the smart TV landscape and the cost and difficulty in being able to get applications to all the places where consumers want to consume that content.
I'll add. I agree with Christopher. I also think search is a huge problem. It's generations behind search that we're accustomed to, and given things like GPT 3.5 and others, I feel like there's in terms of user experience, search and discovery, everyone's sort of settled on the same vanilla interface. And search is not a priority simply because I think people aren't really focused on it at the level that it is in other mediums. So I think that to me is a huge is a huge problem, but a huge opportunity for those that can dive in and solve it.
Well, to add to Eric and Christopher's offers, which are both valid, but I'd add into that making live streaming for sports work at massive scale, and what that means for network traffic and advertising and everything else behind it, and the whole ecosystem. The on-demand side is comparatively much easier than live streaming, as we all know, and there are good reasons for it. So I think that's probably where a lot of the challenges lie.
Yeah, and I'll finish that off with those are absolutely all valid, and I think they stem from one thing, and that's complexity. So the complexity of the workflow and the way that streaming operates in terms of a technology stack with a lack of interoperability creates massive issues in delivering a consistent service. So device fragmentation is a problem. Scale is a problem with live search and content discovery. Rightly, they suck. And it's all, from our perspective, a result of a lack of interoperability.
Yeah, and I guess what I'll chip into that is that all of those are all relevant. Like we have a lot of particular standout issues, and I think you can ask the average consumer, search and discovery, right? Still not quite where they want it. Tony, from your perspective, every problem, and speaking to, let's say, solving complications or interoperability or fragmentation, they're amplified when you're trying to deliver live, right? And people are very unforgiving of problems when watching live sports content, something that they're really engaged in. And talking about the device landscape as well, which I spent quite a lot of time looking at as an analyst. It's true, you have several, well, probably in the landscape, I won't name them all, but about 5 to 6 different significant streaming platforms across smart TVs and streaming devices today. And then within each of those, many variations, right? Especially within the Android TV landscape. So you've got to solve all of these complications to be able to really deliver a solid service today. And, that involves the back end too, reliability and scale. So there's a number of different things, but they come up under different circumstances. And we'll dive a bit further under what type of circumstances as we go through this discussion. And let's switch to something not necessarily technical, but very important. And it's long been substantiated as the most important component of video service success in the content itself, right? We've all heard content is king a million times, but it really is true. And an important factor is selecting what content to invest in, especially now that budgets are getting tighter, making sure that you are getting the most return on your content and making sure you're investing investing in the most appropriate and most revenue generation potential worth of content. That's a bit awkward. It is crucial. And so, how much should you pay for it? How to value it? And how to use better, smarter, deeper use of data to really figure out what to invest in. Is really paramount right now. So how does the industry do this? How does the industry really use AI, ML, big data sets to figure out what to invest in, how to value it, and how best to monetize it? So, I don't know who wants to take this one first. But I think there's a lot there to unpack.
I'll dive in. I think the big metric that we really look at across the board, we're ad centric, so everybody knows the market's becoming very ad centric. We're an ad centric company as well, although we have a big chunk of subscription. But everybody knows the CPM model. For us on the content side and valuing content, we follow kind of a similar model. So it's a cost per 1,000 minutes viewed, right? We call it internally CPV, and that CPV model really is how we benchmark the performance of widely divergent titles that have come into the mix at different times, different time frames. And ultimately, it's a sort of baseline that we use to say, to rank which things did better than the other, right? And when you bump that up against the revenue attributable to a title, you start to get a pretty powerful picture of what the items are costing and how much money you're generating from them. The gray area is in subscription, where it's hard to directly attribute how much economic value you derive for one specific title, but that's where the CPV formula is a good proxy for that in that space. Now, there are ways to directly attribute, did a title drive a subscription and so forth. But ultimately, those are the metrics that we use, and we found some pretty significant success in our platform, automating a lot of the learning that goes along with that. So if you segment that from overall and look at everything, we have 30 different brands and verticals. You can segment down to cost per view per vertical for different subgenres of content. So it's a pretty powerful tool if your platform supports it, or if you can come up with the data to do it.
Yeah, we look at things like engagement accelerators and engagement poison too. Being able to see what's the most popular content, going back to like search algorithms and things. A lot of times it'll just kind of agglomerate around what are people watching, and you understand what your highest viewed content is. Looking at the content where when a new subscriber views it, or a newly joined user watches content X, they end up watching the whole thing 95% of the time, and then they watch the remainder of the series. So being able to kind of use the data to find the hidden gems in the library is particularly important when you're licensing chunks of library content, especially when you have small content management teams. In many cases, they can't possibly watch all of the content that they've licensed fast enough to be able to make use of that content getting on the service when you're licensing multiple seasons of a back catalog, for example. So being able to look at not just what's the stuff that people are watching, because you can really control that through kind of what you throw on the top row, what hero images you use, but also the things when somebody finds it, we want to find the ones where there are only a couple hundred or a couple thousand views, but everybody who watches it finishes it, and everybody who finishes it watches the next couple episodes. Those are the kind of hidden gems that you want to be able to find and invest in more, versus the ones where somebody watches it, they shut it off, they literally never come back to the platform. You kind of look at that and you say, well, I wonder why people are not coming back, and if we can systematically find the areas where our content may be pushing people away, or our content is drawing them in and getting them more engaged in the platform.
I think you can extend the same into the advertising space as well. You can see the same pattern with how far through different adverts are watched, because there are beacons partway through each advert that tells you whether people skip partway through and only watch the first part of it and quickly flick to something else. So that'll help the advertisers create advertising that is engaging, but also help the targeting as well. So those two things can work together. And it's just a parallel question to the one that's for the content.
And I think that especially as we look at budget's getting tighter, right? And we're seeing less and less, or hypothetically less budget being thrown at just commissioning, new titles and commissioning content en masse. Services are going to have to get a bit more intentional in what they're investing in. And some of that, as people look to, in some ways, niche content, or looking at certain fandoms, or looking at, specific genres, let's say, or types of content where people, there may not be a ton of people watching them, but those that do, they watch the heck out of, that particular segment or genre, really understanding what to pick, what the return is going to be, and so on. And it's going to become very important. It's going to become increasingly important And I think putting AI and ML to use to really crunch on a lot of that massive amount of user data out there, especially the second, third order stuff, looking at behavioral insights that perhaps we're not even looking at yet. It's going to be more and more important. Let me spin a little bit from the content question into something else that's related to content that's probably super relevant now, given that we've got such a mix of business models out there now, and especially as services look to the year ahead or the next couple of years ahead, and trying to figure out whether they are a service that's going to stay within their particular model, let's say SVOD, or they look to expanding to AVOD, FAST, and so on, and they start looking at the mix of content that they're going to be delivering. Whether that's between licensed titles, exclusives, originals, linear, live content, and so on, especially live sports. And as part of that, how do they determine that ideal balance to deliver? And on top of that, should they, figuring out whether they should expand or narrow their focus in what they're delivering? Anybody that wants to kind of clarify this picture, how do services really figure out, or what are the steps they should take to try and figure out what to get, what to deliver, and whether they should be expanding or narrowing their focus?
Well, that's the big dilemma, isn't it? I mean, I think to some extent you can take a viewpoint that says if you are going down the path of narrowing your content to try and target a particular genre, then that makes it more amenable to more automation, and so reduces the cost. So that can take you in one direction. But on the other hand, that kind of worked contrary to innovation and new experiences and discovering new content for the consumer. So how long is somebody going to watch that niche piece of content channel until they get bored of that particular type of content? So the mass audience is probably going to be somewhere else. So depending on the scale that you're aiming for, you either need to curate across a pretty diverse basket of types of content, or if you're trying to focus and be very specific about the genre you're trying to get to, then you can do it cheaper, but much more narrowly. So there can't be one answer. It depends on what you're trying to do with the service and what scale of audience you're looking for.
I can mention the journey that we just went on, which is quite interesting. So we're of the conclusion now to go extremely broad, and that in both in terms of business model and available content. I think what led to that was we started out in niche enthusiast content, but we discovered something that was quite compelling data point. We looked at the top 10 streaming services in the world, and we came to a pretty shocking conclusion. Those services represent less than 4% of the film and television output made since 1950 on a global basis, right? So there's this misperception that there is this huge swaths of content on the top 10 streamers. And when you dig even deeper into it, you find an even more trouble. Well, maybe it's troubling to a consumer. It's maybe not as troubling to the people managing the P&Ls at these services. The amount of titles that are available on those services have actually been decreasing. I think the number I saw was Hulu since 2018 has cut its library 66%. Netflix just shy of 30%. Other services are similar. There's a lot of stuff about Warner Bros. Discovery cutting content and so on. But meanwhile, they're charging more for those same contents. I think in the same time period, for example, Hulu's library dropped by that. It's increased by almost 70% on a monthly basis. So if the trend overall among the biggest players is charging a lot for smaller libraries of content, number one, it ties back to your optimization question, right? They're looking and saying, hey, we don't need to spend or have as broad of offerings. And one of the biggest challenges that we're looking at that is saying, wait a second, what happens when transactional goes the way for film and video as it did for music, right? It's very difficult to buy a track today. In the future, you may not be able to buy individual piece of content. So what's going to happen to think about the cultural collective of film and television? It's like the Library of Alexandria burning over all over again in terms of availability. So our vision is, well, shoot, let's lean into this and solve one of the most difficult problems in streaming. How do we be the Spotify of everything else, that 95% that's not available in the big guys? So we came to that conclusion on the basis of looking at the incredible passion that people had for all these verticals. When you add up all of those verticals, it's just like on Spotify. If you like, emo tracks, or if you're big into 80s electronica, it's not big enough for anyone standalone service, but in aggregate, it's a fantastic business. So that's what we're trying. That's how we came to that conclusion, what we're trying to build.
Yeah, and those also have technical as well as the business implications, right?
Absolutely.
The data remaining at rest is one thing, but you get 10 views on 1,000 pieces of content, you still have to go through royalty calculations. You still have to go through and have the people there to be able to run those calculations, and trying to find that balance where the library content is keeping people on the service and is driving enough viewership and enough revenue to be able to kind of balance the books with not just, the technical side is almost irrelevant in some cases. It's more about what's the business need to look like to be able to support that sort of library of content, where with the music industry, there's just such consolidation amongst the record labels that
Right.
they end up being able to kind of be the front door for that 90-ish% of content that has been recorded over the last 150 years or so.
It's a huge challenge. That's why nobody's doing it.
Totally.
Behind all that is the question about profitability for the streaming services. One of the things that makes it difficult to make a profit is if you have a lot of churn, because churn means you then got to market the service and offer discounts for the new subscribers and so on. And the instinctive reaction to cut the spend on content to keep the profitability in the short term is exactly the sort of thing which will drive an increase in that churn and make the profitability more difficult. So there's a real danger there for somebody cutting back on the content libraries or content purchasing to actually drive the business downhill very quickly and off a cliff. So it's kind of perilous and difficult choice. I'm glad it's not one I have to make. So.
But then there's also the flip side of that, where it's there's a lot of geographic opportunity too, right? There's a lot of popular shows made around the world that now we all have the awareness of, and you can really drive a niche audience with. So it's really finding those pieces that drive the viewership and drive the revenue, and being able to super serve those audiences that form around pieces of content and genres of content.
And I think it's an interesting point, talking about international, because I think I was at MIPCOM, and one of the panels there, a colleague within the analyst industry, Guy Bisson, said international is hot as hell. He put a lot of emphasis on it, but it's true. Between licensing international content, having the ability to cross-purpose it. For, let's say you're a multinational service, you're already perhaps licensing that content in Turkey, in Korea, wherever you may already be, understanding how that can be repurposed to another geography where that genre or that type of content has extra legs monetization-wise, I think is a great way to extend the revenue potential for that existing content spend. So definitely a lot of different ways to kind of figure out how best to optimize your content portfolio. But I think there's going to be a lot of question marks going forward as a lot of services begin to be hybrid, 2-3 different types of delivery models, and then really branching out across the types of content. And, Tony, you're probably going to see a lot of business because a lot of people are adding live sports in one way or another to come, and that brings with it its own challenges. So for time's sake, let me move to the next question, which is probably a question for Eric. And if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free, especially because this involves fast services, which everybody has something to speak on. But since Cinedigm is in the business of providing content and channels across SVOD, AVOD, and of course today's hot prospect, fast services are an extremely hot commodity within the industry today. with huge momentum behind, ramping up distribution via that, several hundred channels of, fast channels in that experience, and finding ways to effectively monetize and potentially personalize, that experience is a hot topic right now. And so one thing though, fast services and fast channels, they seem to have a lack of original content, or at least, a lack compared to some of the traditional type of streaming choices we've had in the past. And so originals, if we know anything from the content market, what we learned so far, original content, specialty content, that's exclusive, all of that could potentially be a differentiator in an increasingly crowded, fast market. So is this lack of original content due to a lack of maturity of the fast market, or are there other reasons driving it?
So I'll tell you, it's part of it's a lack of maturity, right? You have, I think the forecast from Magna was that 2025 will see 50% the broadcast market to be down to 50 million households, or it'll be half of what it was at its peak, to say the point. So that's just 3 or 4 more years of ad dollars flowing into fast. That pace is accelerating. I think it's a kind of a reverse flywheel as the big broadcasters cut more programming and put it onto their streaming services. And see, if you go look at broadcast networks today, they're on, literally on autopilot, running 1 or 2 shows ad nauseum for most of the lineup. So the value prop there is rapidly decreasing. The audience is very old relative to fast and other mechanisms. So my sense is that pace is going to accelerate. I think now you would normally say, all right, fast should take up the mantle and start picking up original programming. However, it's going to be a hard-pressed challenge simply because, if you thought the App Store economics situation that Elon Musk is complaining about was bad, it's not great in the fast environment with 30 to 50% of the revenues peeled away off the top to go to the platforms. It doesn't leave a whole lot of room to do original programming. So it'd be the equivalent if in the 40s and 50s, if RCA and Zenith kept half the revenue, we'd still be watching game shows and talk shows. That would be the only programming, because that's all they would be able to afford to make. So I think there has to be a fundamental shift in, it's a zero-sum game that has to be kind of calculated that, hey, the business gets bigger if we have original programming, therefore we probably shouldn't in the early stages be piggish in the revenue splits. Until that kind of gets resolved, then the only other real alternative is these things become, sort of private, closed networks of owned channels, and those get original programming. I think there's a real problem of diversity of voice and choice in the universe if that happens. So I hope that's not the route it goes. It's certainly not a great outcome for independents. My take is that's why it's important to control, to not be platform dependent. Go ask, Zynga almost went out of business a decade ago when Facebook decided to co-opt their model, right? So you can't be overly reliant on any one platform for your revenues or your ability to support original programming, or you won't be able to get there. So I really do think it's predicated on parties that control and own their own platform, operate their own technology, have a diversity of platforms of revenue, so that no one property is too powerful to command too high of a percentage. Is how you win and make enough revenue to be able to afford original programming.
Right. You bring up a good point there. When you look at like broadcast operators and MVPDs and the stability that exists with the inventory split for linear television, a lot of that, I think, coalesced around the fact that there was a different set of advertisers that the networks could go after versus the advertisers that the operators could go after, right? In the digital world, everybody's competing for the same advertisers. They're competing full spectrum, geo-targeted and national and data enabled. And it really turns it into a zero-sum game, where with the linear broadcast models that developed over time, there was there's adversarial when it came to carriage agreements, but when it came to how are we going to make money and who are the market segments that we're going to serve on an advertising front, there was little to no overlap between those two until the advent of satellite networks in the 90s. So I think that there's a challenge. This goes back to the fragmentation as well. Every OEM, it wants to have an app store where they go with the Apple model and take a cut and force you through payments. Everybody wants to be able to aggregate inventory and sell it to the highest bidder, regardless of where and when. Now, obviously, the technology allows us all to do that and to compete vigorously. We've got to do so. But as an industry, we've got to figure out what is that balance of a model so that we can have stability in terms of how we interact with each other, from content owners, tech providers, distributors, and what markets are we serving? Because otherwise, it's just going to be a free for all where the next hot app everybody shifts to, they're going to take a 50% rev share and lean on that for as long as possible until the content flees. And it's just going to be this merry-go-round that costs everybody a ton of money and creates these little explosions of popularity, but not the sort of sustained businesses that we've seen in the television world.
And I think that there's a lot of, well, there's a lot we could technically talk about if we get into the prospect of discussing how much power the platform owners have, but it's true. They are a gatekeeper. And, if we think about how that P&L breaks down, which, thanks, Eric, I didn't really understand how much of that really lies in the control of the platform owner taking that chunk off the top. If we think about the prospect of a Roku, a Samsung, et cetera, being the only ones that can afford to commission original content on their FAST platforms, it's a very sobering proposition. But on top of that, it may not be that originals will be as strong a differentiator as simply being smarter about how we, evolve that FAST experience going forward, right? Driving engagement through those libraries, but by delivering it smarter.
Well, the other piece of this is, we're still looking at FAST, and this happens a lot with new paradigms, new technologies, is FAST is being looked at through the lens of the past, right?
Right.
If you think about it, like a linear feed, what is a Facebook feed or a TikTok feed but a hyper personalized linear? It's linear in terms of you progress from one thing to the next, right? So the idea that we're going to sit around watching pre-programmed feeds when there's all this data and technological capability to more dramatically, we have a platform called Cineverse, which is I'll call it this is our Spotify for video. But one of the things that we're looking at on the FAST side is dynamic, hyper personalized linear channels that imagine having an endless supply of linear channels at your fingertips. So and being able to go, there's something interesting coming up later, being able to go into it at any point. Things like that are just, we're not even close to where this is all going to be evolving in the next few years. We're still playing in its infancy.
I think there's an interesting side that kind of maybe tempers that a little bit, which is that consumption of video is very, very large extent a social activity, even if you're not in the same location. So the exchange of views over what might be a soap opera, so therefore recorded and played out as an asset, played out in real time, but people are interacting in real time, in hard real time on social media. So that kind of brings it together again. So it's socially live rather than genuinely live. And there's a danger that if you break that social bond and you don't have things which are going out concurrently, then actually you lose a lot of that value and social benefit and enjoyment that comes with it. So it's kind of not entirely sure I buy into the everybody gets everything whenever they want. I don't think that works from a social perspective, and it doesn't bring all the value that can come from that content because it doesn't get a body of excitement behind it.
Well, and, you know,
if somebody's seen it already, it's not the same.
You're right. What I'm saying is I think there's always room for pre-programmed, large-scale tune-in events as a marketing capability. What I'm talking about is the vast majority of fast channels today are pretty far from that. They're library content stitched together, sometimes very creatively, sometimes haphazardly. I think in that piece of the universe, there's probably a better mousetrap than what exists today.
Sure, definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Let's look at a different aspect of content and monetization, and essentially, my avenue here is looking at engagement, right, and churn, and how that's all linked together with the content, and really, as we look towards the future and services really trying to optimize their performance, optimize their fiscal performance, we really need to concentrate on that age-old problem that remains a problem, is churn, right? And churn is still big in the streaming industry, partially because the inherent nature of streaming and OTT services, right? It's easy to subscribe, it's easy to leave. From what we've already learned, having battled churn for years and years now, how does services best drive continued engagement, mitigate churn, and keep people inside of their ecosystems today?
I think Eric.
I think we talked about some of the aspects of the content-related side of that already, in terms of what content gets supplied and how it gets recommended and so forth. And that's absolutely valid. But I think there's also a delivery question as well. So the experience of somebody watching a streaming service has to be at least as good as a broadcast service for it to last in the long term. Now, one of the interesting statistics came across a while ago is that the broadcast services basically run at the same operational availability as the emergency services, the police and fire brigade and so on. So kind of sets a bar quite high. And most cloud-based services for other things are nowhere near that. So that expectation is really high. And so meeting that, obviously you have to put in the infrastructure for that to happen, excuse me, but you also have to be able to know when it's not happening. So that comes down to how do you detect when something's not working right, and hopefully do it early enough that you can take some measure to avoid it. And there are lots of tools here. We know about client metrics that come back and they can tell you whether there's a failure or whatever, but there are also tools that can be deployed inside the networks to put synthetic clients that can behave like a real client, but actually feedback metrics in a reliable fashion. So there's some good tools around to be able to gather that information. And in the long run, this is sort of place where you might use some machine learning to find unusual patterns of behavior. That's not necessarily as easy as it sounds, because things don't necessarily go wrong the same way. But potentially it's got a way of reducing the operational overhead to get that reliability.
I'll add in, there's probably, if you kind of look at the whole problem of churn, most of the way it's been dealt with historically has been structurally, and through structure, I mean, either you make it, you literally make it more difficult for people to leave structurally, which is, consumer unfriendly, or you add an incredible amount of value through other types of structural mechanism, marketing, and so on. And I think that's likely, if you look at the historically low churn rates that we saw of cable television, it was simply because you couldn't cancel the things you weren't watching, so you had to keep everything if you wanted anything. And I think what you're probably going to see is a return, in response to some pretty, look, if you look at, say, Disney and all these others, they have 4 to 5% churn in most cases, which sounds low until you realize that they have to replace, 15, 20 million consumers annually. There's not an infinite amount of people to keep going back to. So my take is long-term, bundling is the only way to really achieve the historically low churn rates. Netflix even has a problem with churn at their current churn rates. So I think that's where you're going to see things go.
Yeah, and I mean, we're also looking at a space where we're competing for consumer time when there's just been an explosion in high fidelity entertainment options, right? You look at the history of television, and TV was an order of magnitude, if not more, better in terms of the entertainment experience that it could deliver to a consumer in their home. And now consumers have a whole range of devices and video games and experiences that they can literally just click away to. So in some ways, we have to fight harder for every second of engagement of those consumers, because there are competitors and competition that just wasn't there when you're looking at some of the years where we baselined and the bundles started to exist to kind of get consumers into that TV ecosystem.
I think that's right, and it also changes the nature of the type of content you provide as well. So we're obviously considering, when we're talking about this, a like-for-like replacement, broadcast TV with a streaming TV. But actually, as kind of we do with the NBA, we provide a lot more sophisticated service with that. You can not only watch the match, you can watch, I think, 17 different versions of the match, and you can interact with it with metadata that's being delivered and synchronized in real time, or even if you're playing it back. Those sort of things make it much stickier because they're valued by the consumer. They might not be the content itself, but they're definitely valued. So I think those are the things that can actually make the service more interesting to the consumer and therefore reduce that churn. So there are a lot of things that go into that mix beyond the technology.
Thanks, Tony. And thanks, everyone. I'm going to actually skip ahead a little bit to see if we can cover two last questions before we run out of time here. This is actually one and another hot topic, live sports. Good for Chris and Tony. So between Endeavor Streaming, powering the WWE and UFC, and MediaKind's heavy involvement in sports streaming, this is a great question for the two of you. So right now, live content's a tremendous X factor for the industry, and we see a lot of industry heavyweights heavily leveraging or planning to leverage live sports, from Disney to Netflix to Amazon. And in getting that live event, live sports streaming experience right and confidence inspiring in its reliability is important for the future of the industry. How close is the industry to matching the broadcast experience, and what are the biggest technical and business and technical challenges that are left to solve?
Well, I mean, I can jump in on the technical side. So, largely it is, again, complexity. So you have sports streamers who are using 5, 6, 7 different delivery networks. So they're managing multiple infrastructure providers. Everything's in real time. So, you can look at data about what people are doing and how they're watching and the problems, but if you don't solve them before they happen, then, those people get angry and they churn. So back to that naughty C word. That on the technical side, we are both close and not close. There are a lot of new protocols that are coming out that people are testing in terms of scalability, like WebRTC. There are different use cases for the use of different protocols. And again, we're continuing to push forward on this. And every big live streaming event, we see more concurrent sessions supported at a higher bitrate resolution. So again, we're moving in the right direction, but the answer is, do we have parity with broadcast? Again, yes and no, right? Can you broadcast 4K? No. Can you stream 4K? Yes. So in that sense, it's a little ahead. Can you scale it like you can broadcast? No. So there's all of these sort of like a little bit ahead, a little bit behind. Live streaming right now is moving in a great direction because there's so much energy being put behind it, especially with with the World Cup happening right now and the big cricket matches and leagues that have happened in the past few months. So we're seeing some great movement towards it, but broadcast is broadcast, right? It can support 50, 60, 70 million concurrent users. Streaming cannot do that yet, but it does exceed the broadcast experience in some ways. So, again, hard question to answer from a technical perspective as being an absolute, but it's definitely moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Jason. Well, we're about to run up against time. So Chris or Tony, whoever wants to take it first, if you can give me a two or three sentence answer.
I think the key thing to bear in mind for live streaming at massive scale is it has to involve the operators too. They're the ones who run the networks, which are the last mile. If that doesn't have the capacity to deliver it, doesn't matter what else happens further up the network. And there's a real tendency for streaming service providers to forget that there's actually a physical, real network at the end of it. It's getting built out for broadband data transport reasons, so both fiber to the home and cable DOCSIS node splits. But ultimately, if we're trying to ramp up streaming services faster than that can increase, then there's a discussion needed with the operators. So the operators have to get involved, or have to be involved in this.
Thank you, Tony. And unfortunately, that's all the time we've got, so I have to bring it to a close. We could certainly talk for, who knows, an hour or two more when it comes to the biggest challenges that are threatening the industry today and how to really solve them. So I'd like to close the discussion and thank Tony from MediaKind, Eric from Cinedigm, Jason from the SVTA, and Chris from Endeavor Streaming for their great insights today. And thank you all in the audience for joining us for this discussion. Take care.
Yeah, bye.